You want your peaches to glow through. We just want this to have just that cast of green. And you want it to be, relatively smooth. You don't want to have so much extender in it that you're chasing it, but you want to have enough extender in this so that it will actually move. And you just want, just a hint of a glaze. We're all familiar with mason jars. They just have that blue-green color. I'm going to glaze this top to bottom, edge to edge. If you get any on your rolling pin, it's probably not a huge deal, unless it makes your rolling pin look like it's molding. Now you have two choices on putting the word Mason on. One choice is to freehand it. The other is to drop your tracing back on top and etch into the wet paint with a stylus, no graphite. Before we get to the word Mason, let's start by building some of our shines. We have the primary shine. Of course, the primary shine is where the light is hitting it directly. Notice this starts down just a little bit. It doesn't start in this recessed area. Also notice that it curves, following the curve of the container. Warm white, coming back and adding the sparkles. You can also go slightly on that outside edge, and you don't exactly line it, but you put in a warm white line and then come back and lose it just a little bit, because you want to have the walls of the glass, but if you outline it, it'll look a little trite. Now on the left side, we're going to do similar things. We have the pass-through light in the lower left. Even though this is filled with peaches, it still has just some pass-through because it's not completely solid. This horizontal shine helps define that front curve. So put those shines in and then smooth them out. And your main goal is to be sure that these cooler shines on the left side away from the light do not become lighter and brighter than the ones on that right hand side. I like how the picture looks kind of glowing through and a little on the distorted side. This glass is, I think, kind of easy to do because we've done so much preliminary work. We have peaches inside that define the form. We came back and added a glaze and defined the form even more. And now all we have to do is just build some zinger type shines across to just give it that final top layer. You want to have some thickness down at the bottom. just to show where the foot of the glass is. And I think your glass will look fairly realistic if you keep your primary shine the brightest, then the next brightest shine is in this lower left. Now you may have noticed that you can see a reflection of the rolling pin handle. And the best thing about that is that it adds some interest to a previously kind of dull area. So I'm coming in with my mid-value green and placing this on, distorting it, because we know that it's going to distort as it goes across the front of the glass. And then what we have is we have the actual rolling pin. You can put that in, and again kind of add some interest in a previously boring area. And in the sample it looks a little greenish, just depends on how much glaze you're working into. Then to make sure that this looks like a reflection, you have to pull a shine over the top. This one's getting a little bright, so I'll knock it down. Now to do the word mason, very lightly fill in with warm white the letters. This should just be just a buff of color. I'm freehanding it, so I just ended up with the word ma. Then on the right side of these letters, you want to add a shine. You don't want to outline, it's just any part that's a right side of the letter. That's where you want to add the shine. The eye connects it up. So just any right side of a letter, add a shine. So up here, but notice we didn't put any in this area. Could probably maybe put a little tiny bit. But what you don't want to do is just outline the letters. You want to come back and say upper right, right side, upper. Just find it as just with a few sparks as possible. Then come in with a very sparsely loaded brush with some black and shadow. And where do shadows fall? They fall to the left. They fall opposite of the light source. And so it's going to be on the left side of this sweep. Again, you're not outlining it, just saying to the left, to the left. And you could certainly do this in stages. If you're kind of frightened of these letters, you can do fewer like I did. You can wait till it's dry and put them on. And now toward the end of developing this glass, I'm just checking to see if there's any place I could add a little bit more something just to make it that much more interesting. But this glass has turned out to be very interesting. We have a reflection of a rolling pin into it. We have raised letters. We have peach preserves of all different sizes. Light dancing across. If your peaches have become too dull, you can come back and glaze them a little bit oranger, but we do want them to look a little bit dull because they're back behind some green glass. And they're not a star player. Now that all of our shines are in, let's move on to the shadow work so that we can finish up the piece. Shadows are the last thing that we're going to put in. And with shadows, what you have to realize is that they're very similar to shines in that they start off transparent and then become opaque. And so what I'm doing initially is I'm putting in, just like with the shines, I'm putting in the transparent aspect. Going around this gooseberry. I really don't want him to be totally caught up in this shadow. But what I'm doing is I'm putting in the shadows. And notice the shadow comes in front just a little bit. And you do have a page on placement. And you also have excellent photos. But what happens with shadows is they fall opposite of the light source. So our light's coming from the right, and so our shadows are going to fall to the left. And after you get in that first initial shadow, you come back with opaque black. And the first one I put in with black, but I just stretched it. Now I'm coming in and adding very, very dark black. Because what I'm trying to do, and it might take a couple of times, I don't know, but what I'm trying to do is not be able to see where the object ends and the table begins. And notice, and you can see this on your written material, but notice that the shadow goes up onto the container. And that's what's going to unite it to the surface. So if you paint around the container, what's going to happen is you'll just have an outlined look to your container. If I ever paint this again, I will not put this gooseberry right here. But this gooseberry has a round shine because it is round. And notice that the shadow goes onto the little gooseberry, cements it. Working with the raspberries, initially create the overall cast shadow. The front of the scoop is casting a shadow onto the berries and inside of the scoop. Scoop is casting a shadow onto the granite. This is just coming alive. Shadows are actually my favorite part. Contact shadow where the scoop is contacting the table. This has a little bit of an overhang, so we're having a little bit of a shadow over there. And then I think I'm going to have a really nice shadow from this handle. Kind of a neat shadow, maybe you didn't notice it. There's a shadow from the handle onto the fruit and vegetables. It's pretty much only on the green pepper. Everything else is a little too far away. Notice it curves following the shape of the green pepper. I've started these shadows, but you can also shadow from the front of the pail onto the contents. And this makes it look as if the gooseberries, the apple, everything is moved back a little bit so they would catch a shadow. I'm going to come back and deepen the contact shadow with those raspberries. Strengthen where that scoop rests on the table. You can't really see where the berry begins and the table ends, or vice versa. That's the way I want it. Now it looks like they're in their environment. Let's do the interesting rolling pin shadow. Now as you're working this, if the paint will not move, that is where you pull out your little bit of extender, whether it's thinning medium or a little bit of terp. So if it gets pitted looking, that's when you need to stop and add something to make it move. But again, just start by putting on the large cast shadow. Very thin, transparent. Because it reminds me of doing shines. You start off transparent and then move to opaque. If you're not a fan of rubbing this out with your finger, you can of course employ a mop or a scrubby brush. I use my ring finger, it's weak. Notice I'm going up onto the rolling pin. So it's kind of an interesting little shadow. If your initial shadow is not transparent, you need to come back and make it so. I would say the contact shadows are not transparent, but that initial one is. When you come back with the contact shadow, you have to use thicker, more opaque paint. Otherwise, if you use paint that has any extender in it for the second go round, it'll just eat up the first shadow that you put down. So you definitely have to go with more opaque paint. It's the law of, maybe law is too strong of a word, but it's, you have to go from lean to fat. You start off with lean paint and then work fatter paint into it. If you try to put lean on top of lean, it doesn't work. It just eats what's already down. So if you want to put more paint on top of what you have here, it has to be thicker. Now if you dry, you can just start again. You don't have to worry about lean and fat once it's dry. We do want to put a shadow from the table all the way across where that sponging is, and that will definitely separate those. And of course that white table would cast a shadow onto the blue sponged area. And another shadow that you can work in at the same time is there's a shadow from the blue sponged area onto your cabinet. And this just goes all the way across. Let's place the peach shadow. First we have to cast a shadow from the peach onto its background, which is actually the leaf. Again, notice how it's getting caught up in that shadow just a little bit. Adding a little dark for form. Now we can add the shadow from the leaf onto the table. Again, start off with the transparent haze. We have to add, of course, a shadow from our leaf onto our peach itself. Now, if you love your peach and you don't want to add this shadow, that's okay. Just adds a little bit more dimension, of course. Coming in with the strengthening. You should put down 2 values, and then when you blend them, end up with seeing a third. Look how that just told an interesting little story there. It's touching and then hanging over. The shadow from the glass does a couple of things. One, it comes onto this picture. So start off with the transparent haze. Curves when it gets to the curving section of the picture. You should be able to see everything through the transparent haze. If you can't see the picture, especially the stripes we so diligently built up, you have to go back and remove a little bit. We have to have the contact shadow for the glass, and of course the glass itself is going to cast a shadow. Again, if you're getting anything that resembles a pitted look, what that means is you need to extend out your paint. And by extender, I'm always referring to something that will make your paint move. I don't like to call it medium because that gets confused with medium value. So I always will call it extender. Now adding that little bit more of a solid shadow from the glass. And the glass ends up having a pretty good shadow because it's full of peach preserves. Now if this glass were just empty and just glass, it wouldn't have hardly any shadow because the light would pass through. And the light's being obstructed because it's just full of those peaches. So that shadow gets built up. The shadow from the picture will finally anchor this massive thing. The whole foot could just be glazed away. It is very large, it's very bulbous, so we're going to put on a large shadow. And the upside of this large shadow is it's going to fill a very void area. So coming in first with the transparent color. It goes on the underneath as well. It can look a little sloppy, but we can certainly smooth it. If you can't smooth it, then you might have to wait and let some of the extender evaporate. The edges of your shadows, because of our light source, the edges of your shadows are quite diffused. They're soft. And so if you end up with really strong, hard edges on your shadows, you'd have to have a different light source. So now I'm coming in with the opaque black. If your black ever ends up looking like dirty, what you might want to think about doing is adding just a little bit of burnt umber. It always depends on how you've developed your table. Now this is such a large shadow, you might have to dry it and keep building it if it gets away from you. Or if you put paint down and it just won't accept anymore. But here it's getting darker, it's having value change. If I want to add more, which I do, this is where you come in again with opaque paint. Each layer that you add has to have less extender. And again, if it gets to the point where it's just slipping around, you can't do a thing with it, dry it, and then you can start where you left off. But I know sometimes these shadows look a little intimidating, especially a very large dark shadow on a very large white background. So you could approach it a little bit more cautiously than I am. This is starting to get saturated. It's just not accepting any more paint. So I think I'll have to dry it and work on it some more. But I think you get the idea with the shadow. In terms of adjustments on this painting, I think that glazing down this whole back edge of the table and curving a little bit over on this brass area and darkening down your background is about all the adjustment that it needs. We want to lose this back table edge, but I'm going to let you go ahead and glaze that down, and that should take you to finished on this last segment. Now that your painting is finished, let's discuss varnish just a little bit. You have a few options on varnish. You can use a spray-on varnish such as Liberty. That's a one that works well with the Genesis and traditional oils. If you would like to use a brush-on varnish, I would recommend building up quite a few coats with JW Gloss, and then maybe finishing up with JW Matte or Satin just to cut the shine. If you prefer a wipe-on varnish, I would suggest using the final coat varnish. What's interesting is you can actually combine any of these products together. You can put down one and finish up with another. And the other thing that is a nice aspect of all of these varnishes is you can come back and paint on top of any of them. So if you get finished and you think, oh, I wish I would have done this, or now that I see it varnished, I realize this is too bright or too dull, you can come back and paint on top of any of these varnishes. So that's why these are the recommended varnishes. Thank you for painting this piece with me, and we'll see you next time.